Chapter 9. In the drifting lifeboats. Sorrow and suffering. The survivors see the Titanic go down with their loved ones on board. A night of agonizing suspense. Women help to row. Help arrives, picking up the lifeboats. 16 boats were in the procession, which entered the terrible hours of rowing, drifting, and in suspense. Women wept for lost husbands and sons. Sailors sobbed for the ship, which had been their pride. Men choked back tears and sought to comfort the widowed. Perhaps, they said, the other boats might have put it off in another direction. They strove, though, none too sure themselves, to convince the women of the certainty that a rescue ship would appear. Suffering in the lifeboats. The most distressing stories are those given the experiences of the passengers in lifeboats. These tell not only of their own suffering, but give the harrowing details of how they saw the great hulk of the Titanic stand on end, stern upmost, for many minutes before plunging to the bottom of the Atlantic. As this spectacle was witnessed by groups of the survivors in the boats, they plainly saw many of those whom they had just left behind leaping from the decks into the water. In the distance, the Titanic looked like an enormous length. Her great bulk, outlined in black against the starry sky, was every porthole and saloon blazing with light. It was possible to think anything could go wrong with such a leviathan, were it not for the ominous tilt downwards in the bows, where the water was now up to the lowest row of portholes. Presently, about 2 a.m., as near as can be determined, those in lifeboats observed her settling very, very rapidly, with the bows and the bridge completely underwater, and concluding it was now only a question of minutes before she went down. So it proved. She slowly tilted straight on end, with the stern vertically upwards, and as she did, the lights in the cabins and saloons, which until then had not flickered for a moment, died out, came on again for a single flash, and finally went altogether. At the same time, the machinery roared down through the vessel, with a rattle and a groaning that could be heard for miles, the weirdest sound, surely, that could be heard in the middle of the ocean, 1,000 miles away from land. But this was not yet quite the end. To the amazement of the awed watchers in the lifeboats, the doomed vessel remained in that upright position for a time estimated at 5 minutes. Some in the boat say less, but it was certainly some minutes that at least 150 feet of the Titanic towered up above the level of the sea and loomed black against the sky. Chapter 10. On board the Carpathia. Burying the dead. Aid for the suffering and hysterical. Vote of thanks to captain of the Carpathia. Identifying those saved. Communicating with land. The passage to New York. After the Carpathia had made certain that there were no more passengers of the Titanic to be picked up, she was swung around to tread her way out of the ice fields, and her passengers had a chance to talk to the survivors of the RMS Titanic. For 50 miles, the Carpathia sailed through the ice fields. It was dangerous work at all, but the Carpathia's navigators managed to miss trouble. There were sea burials for those who were lost in making the transfer, and for one who died on the way in. None of these was a first-class passenger. The Episcopal bishop and a Catholic priest from Montreal read services from their respective churches over the dead. The bodies were sewed up in sacks, heavily weighted at the feet, and taken to an opening in the side of the ship on the lower deck, not far from the waterline. The long plank tilted out one end served as the in-lying down, which weighted sacks slid into the sea. The women aboard Carpathia did what they could by word and act to relieve the suffering of the record rescued people. Most of the survivors were in great need of clothing, and this is the women of the Carpathia who supplied them as long as their surplus stock held out. J.A. Shuttleworth of Louisville, Kentucky, befriended Mrs. Lucian Smith, whose husband went down with the Titanic. Mrs. Smith's father was a Congressman Hughes of Kentucky, and when Mr. Shuttleworth found that Mrs. Smith came from Kentucky, the Smiths were on their wedding trip. He asked her if there wasn't something he could do for her. She said that all the money she had was lost on the Titanic, so Mr. Shuttleworth gave her $50. A passenger on the Carpathia said there was no wonder that none of the wireless telegrams addressed to Mr. Ismay were answered until the one that he sent yesterday afternoon to his line, the White Star Line. Mr. Ismay was beside himself, said this woman passenger, and most of the voyage after we had picked him up, he was being quieted with opiates and orders of the ship's doctor. On Tuesday afternoon, a meeting was held in a saloon, attended by all the survivors of the Titanic's saloon passengers. Mr. Goldberg, who took the chair, expressed in a vote of thanks to the captain of the Carpathia, A.H. Rostrom. Chapter 11. Preparations on land to receive the sufferers. Police arrangements, donations of money and supplies, hospitals and ambulances made ready, private houses thrown open, waiting for the Carpathia to arrive, the ship sighted. New York City touched to the heart by a great ocean calamity and desired to do what it could to lighten the woes and relieve the suffering of the pitiful little band of men and women rescued from the Titanic, opened both its heart and its purse. The most careful and systematic plans were made for the reception and transfer to homes, hotels, and institutions of the Titanic's survivors. Mayor Gaynor, with Police Commissioner Waldo, arranged to go down to the bay on a police boat patrol to come up with the Carpathia and take charge of the police arrangements at the pier. In anticipation of the enormous number that would, for a variety of reasons, credible or otherwise, surge about the Cunard pier at the coming of the Carpathia, Mr. Gaynor and the police commissioner had seen to it that the streets would be rigidly sentineled by continuous lines of policemen. Under Inspector George McCluskey, the man of most experience, perhaps in handling large crowds, there were 200 men, including 12 mounted men and a number in civilian clothing. For 2 blocks to the north, south, and east of the dock lines were established, through which none save those bearing passes from the government in the Cunard line could penetrate. With all arrangements made that experience and information could suggest, the authorities settled down to await the docking of the Carpathia. No word had come to either the White Star Line or the Cunard Line. They said that any of the Titanic's people had died on the ship, or that the bodies had been recovered from the sea. But in the afternoon, Mayor Gaynor sent word to the Board of Coroners that it might be well for some of that body to meet the incoming ships. Coroners Freenberg and Holzhauer, with coroner's physician Weston, arranged to go down to the bay on the patrol, while Colonel Hellestein waited at the pier. An undertaker was notified to be ready if needed. Fortunately, there was no such need. Every possible measure of relief for the survivors could be thought of by the officials in the city, by the federal government, by the heads of hospitals, and by the Red Cross and relief societies was arranged for. A municipal lodging house, which was accommodated for 700 persons, agreed to throw open its doors and furnish lodging and food to any of the survivors as long as they should need it. Chapter 12. The Bitter Homecoming. The Carpathia reaches New York. An intense and dramatic moment. Hysterical reunions and crushing disappointments at the dock. Caring for the sufferers. Final realization that all hope for others is futile. The Carpathia arrived at the entrance to Ambrose Channel a few minutes after 7 o'clock. She was coming fast, steaming at better than 15 knots an hour, and she was sighted long before she was expected. Except for the usual side and mast headlights, she was almost dark, only the upper cabin showing a glimmer here and there. There was no response to the hail from one tug, and as others closed into the steamship, quickened her speed a little and left them behind as she swung up the channel. There was a booming of flashlights from some of the tugs, answering seamlessly by sharp stabs of lighting in the northwest, and served to accentuate the silence and absence of a light aboard the rescue ship. 5 or 6 persons, apparently members of the crew or the ship's officers, were seen along the rail, but otherwise the boat appeared to be completely deserted. Off quarantine, the Carpathia slowed down, hailing the immigration inspection boat, asked if the health officer wished to board. She was told that he did, and came to a stop while Dr. O'Connell and 2 assistants climbed on board. Again, the newspaper men asked for some word as to the catastrophe of the Titanic, but there was no answer, and getting quickly underway, the Carpathia sped on to her pier. As she passed the revenue cutter Mohawk and the derelict destroyer Seneca anchored off Tompkinville, a wire and the government vessel was seen to flash, but there was no answering spark from the Carpathia. Entering the North River, she laid course close to the New Jersey side in order to have room to swing into her pier. By the time the rails were lined with men and women, they were very silent. There were few requests for news, and those on board and few answers to questions shouted from the tugs. The Carpathia was soon the center of a little fleet of tugboats, some of them carrying newspapermen and friends of relatives of the survivors, and the other boats, those that were to help the Carpathia, into her pier. She stopped opposite the Cunard piers and hung for a time in mid-river while the Titanic's lifeboats were lowered over the side, picked up by the tugs and brought alongside the Merritt Chapman wrecking tug Champion, which hoisted them to her decks. Chapter 13. The story of Charles F. Hurd. How the Titanic sank, boilers exploded, water strewn with dead bodies, victims met death with hymns on their lips. How the Titanic sank is told by Charles F. Hurd, staff correspondent for the New York Evening World, who was a passenger on the Carpathia and who finished that newspaper with his account. He praised the courage of the crew, hundreds of whom gave their lives with heroism which equaled it but could not exceed that of John Jacob Astor, Henry B. Harris, and others in a long list of first cabin passengers. Boilers exploded. It was the explosion of the boilers, according to Mr. Hurd's account, which finally finished the Titanic's career. The bulkhead system, though probably working, availed only to delay in the ship's sinking. The positions of the ship's wound on the starboard quarter admitted icy water, according to Hurd's story, which caused the boilers to explode, and these explosions broke the ship in two. The ship's string band gathered in a saloon near the end, the narrative says, and played Nearer My God to Thee. The account continues. The crash against the iceberg, which had been slighted at only a quarter-mile distance, came almost simultaneously with the click of the levers operated from the bridge, which stopped the engines and closed the watertight doors. Captain Smith was on the bridge a moment later, summoning all on board to put on life preservers and ordering the lifeboats lowered. The first boats had more male passengers, as the men were the first to reach the deck. When the rush of frightened men and women and crying children to the decks began, the women first rule was rigidly enforced. Officers drew revolvers, but in most cases there was no use for them. Revolver shots heard shortly before the Titanic went down caused many rumors. One that Captain Smith had shot himself, another that First Officer Murdoch had ended his life, but members of the crew discredit these rumors. Captain Smith was last seen on the bridge just before the ship sank, leaping only after the decks had been washed away. What became of the men with the life preservers was a question asked by many since the disaster. Many of these life preservers were seen to go down. Chapter 14. Thrilling Account by L. Beasley. Collision, only a slight jar. Passengers could not believe the vessel was doomed. Narrow escape of life, picked up by the Carpathia. In the stories of some of the survivors of the Titanic, there are hints of panic and disorder, but the most connected recitals gave the impression that the passengers hardly realized that the great unsinkable ship could be in danger, and that even after those saved had taken to the boats, they could not believe that all left on board were doomed. L. Beasley of Cambridge, England, told his story. The voyage from Queenstown had been quite uneventful. Very fine weather was experienced, and the sea was quite calm. The wind had been westerly to southwesterly in the whole way, but the cold, particularly the last day. In fact, after dinner on Saturday evening, it was almost too cold to go on the deck. Only a slight jar. I had been in my berth for about 10 minutes, when about 11:15 p.m. I felt a slight jar, and then soon after a second one, but not sufficiently large enough to cause any anxiety at all, however nervous they may have been. However, the engine stopped immediately afterwards, and my first thought was we had lost a propeller. I went up to the boat deck in a dressing gown and found only a few persons there who had come up similarly to inquire why we had stopped, but there was no sort of anxiety in the minds of anyone at all. We saw through the smoking room, the window, a game of cards going on, and went in to inquire if they knew anything. It seems they felt more of the jar, and looking through the window had seen a huge iceberg go by real close to the side of the boat. They thought we had just grazed it with a glancing blow, and that the engines had been stopped to see if any damage had been done. No one, of course, had any conception that the vessel had been pierced below by part of the submerged iceberg. The game went on without any thought of disaster, and I retired to my cabin to read until we went on again. I never saw any of the players or the onlookers again. Some were awakened. A little later, hearing people going upstairs, I went out again and found everyone wanting to know why the engines had stopped. No doubt many were awakened from sleep by the sudden stopping of a vibration to which they had become accustomed during the 4 days we had been on board. Chapter 15. Jack Thayer's own story of the wreck. 17-year-old son of Pennsylvania Railroad official tells moving story of his rescue. Told mother to be brave. Separated from parents. Jumped when vessel sank. Drifted on overturned boat picked up by Carpathia. One of the calmest of the passengers was young Jack Thayer, the 17-year-old son of Mr. and Mrs. John B. Thayer. When his mother was put into the lifeboat, he kissed her and told her to be brave, saying that he and his father would be all right. He and Mr. Thayer stood on the deck in a small boat in which Mrs. Thayer was a passenger, made of from side of the Titanic over the smooth sea. The boy's own account of his experience as he told one of his rescuers is one of the most remarkable of all wonderful ones that have come from a tremendous catastrophe. Father was in bed, and mother and myself were about to get into bed. There was no great shock. I was on my feet at the time, and I do not think it was enough to throw anyone down. I put on an overcoat and rushed up to A deck on the port side. I saw nothing there. I then went forward to the bow to see if I could see any sign of ice. The only ice I saw was on the well deck. I could not see very far ahead, having just come out of the brightly lit room. I then went down to our room, and my father and mother came on deck with me to the starboard side of A deck. We could not see anything there. Father thought he saw small pieces of ice floating around, but I could not see any myself. There was no big berg. We walked around to the port side, and the ship had then a fearless to port. We stayed there looking over the side for about 5 minutes. The list seemed very slowly, and it seemed to be increasing. We then went down to our rooms on C deck, all of us dressing quickly, putting on all our clothes. We all put on life preservers, and over these we put over our overcoats. Then we hurried up to the deck and walked around, looking out at different places until the women were all ordered to collect on the port side, separated from parents. Father and I said goodbye to Mother at the top of the stairs on A deck. She and the maid went right out on A deck onto the port side, and we went to the starboard side, as at this time we had no idea the boat would sink. We walked around A deck and then went to B deck. Then we thought we would go back to see if Mother had gotten off safely, and went to the port side of A deck. We met the chief steward off the main dining saloon, and he told us that Mother had not yet taken a boat, and he took us to her. Father and Mother went ahead, and I followed. They went down to B deck, and a crowd got in front of me, and I was not able to catch them, and lost sight of them. As soon as I could get through the crowd, I tried to find them on B deck, but without success. That is the last time I saw my father. This was about 1/2 an hour before she sank. I then went to the starboard side, thinking that Father and Mother must have gotten off the boat. All of this time, I was with a fellow named Milton C. Long of New York, whom I had just met that evening. On the starboard side, the boats were getting away quickly. Some boats were already off in the distance. We thought of getting into one of the boats, the last boat to go on the forward part of the starboard side, but there seemed to be such a crowd around I thought it unwise to make any attempt to get into it. He and I stood by the davits of one of the boats that had left. I did not notice anybody that I knew except Mr. Lindley, whom I had also just met that evening. I lost sight of him a few minutes later. Long and I stood by the rail just a little aft of the captain's bridge. Thought ship would float. The list to the port had been growing greater all the time. About this time, the people began jumping from the stern. I thought of jumping myself, but was afraid of being stunned and hitting the water. 3 times, I made up my mind to jump out and slide down the davit ropes and try to make it to the boats that were lying off from the ship. But each time, Long had got hold of me and told me to wait a while. He then sat down and I stood up waiting to see what would happen. Even then, we thought she might possibly stay afloat. I got a sight on the rope between the davits and the star and noticed that she was gradually sinking. About this time, she straightened up on an even keel and started to go down fairly fast, at an angle of about 30 degrees. As she started to sink, we left the davits and went back and stood by the rail, about even with the second funnel. Long and myself said goodbye to each other and jumped on the rail. He put his legs over and held on for a minute and asked me if I was coming. I told him I would. I would be with him in a minute. He did not jump clear, but slid down the side of the ship. I never saw him again. About 5 seconds after he jumped, I jumped out, feet first. I was clear of the ship, went down, and as I came up, I was pushed away from the ship by some force. I came up facing the ship, and one of the funnels seemed to be lifted off and fell towards me about 15 yards away, with a mast of sparks and steam coming out of it. I saw the ship in a sort of red glare, and it seemed to me that she broke in two just in front of me, just in front of the third funnel. This time I was sucked down, and as I came up, I pushed out again and twisted around by a large wave, coming up in the midst of a great deal of small wreckage. As I pushed my hand from my head, it touched a cork fender of an overturned lifeboat. Chapter 16. Women forced into lifeboats with revolvers. Why some men were saved before women. Asked to man lifeboats. Surrounded by his wife and members of his family, James McGough of Philadelphia, a buyer for Gimbel Brothers, whose fate had been in doubt, recited a most thrilling and graphic picture of the disaster. As the Carpathia docked, Mrs. McGough, a brother and several friends of the buyer, met him, and after the touching reunion had taken place, the party proceeded to Philadelphia. Vivid in detail, Mr. McGough's story differs essentially from one of the imagination would paint, and declared that the boat was driving at a high rate of speed at the time of the accident, and seemed impressed by the calmness and apathy displayed by the survivors as they tossed on the frozen seas in little lifeboats until the Carpathia was able to pick them up. The Titanic did not plunge into the water suddenly, he declared, but settled down into the deep with its hundreds of passengers. The collision occurred at 20 minutes of 12, said Mr. McGough. I was sleeping in my cabin when I felt a wrench, not severe or terrifying. It seemed to me to be nothing more serious than a reciting of the screw, which often occurs when the screw racing. When a ship plunges her bow deep into a heavy swell, raising the stern out of water. We dressed hurriedly and ran to the upper deck. There was little noise or tumult at the time. The promenade decks, being higher than the base of the ship and thus more insecure, strained and creaked, so we went to the lower decks. By this time, the engines had been reversed, and I could feel the ship backing off. Officers and stewards ran through the corridor, shouting for all to be calm, but there was no danger. We were warned, however, to dress and put life preservers on us. I had on what was clothing I could find and had stuffed some money in my pocket. Parting of Astor and bride. As I passed the gymnasium, I saw Colonel Astor and his young wife together. She was clinging to him, politely pleading that he go into the lifeboat with her. He refused, almost gruffly, and was attempting to calm her by saying that all her fears were groundless, that the incident she feared would prove a farce.